Why are we as an audience so drawn to the concept of evil? I mean, sure, the hero might save the day, but in some of our greatest films, it's the villain who provokes the most discussion. We are honored tonight to welcome to the program a very accomplished speaker, consultant, writer, award-winning producer, director, whose new book titled The Power of the Dark Side explores methods for creating memorable villains in dangerous situations. She teaches at the very best schools and companies across the globe, and she's also the founder of MythWorks, which you can find at www.mythworks.net. It is a great pleasure to welcome to the program Pamela Jaye Smith to discuss her new book with us. Let me bring her up real quick on our switchboard. Let me bring the switchboard up here. Ms. Smith, are you with us?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us tonight. I loved your book. I can't wait to discuss it with you. Give me a little sense first, though, of your career trajectory, how this journey began for you.
Well, I've always been interested in writing, and like a lot of people who are writers, started telling stories and writing when I was very young. And just kind of naturally fell into it after a couple of false starts at pre-med and music and other things like that, and got into film school at the University of Texas at Austin. And it was a great place to be going to film school, learning about film. A lot of Hollywood movies were coming there, and I worked on a couple of them and then moved to Hollywood to pursue a real career in show business.
So tell me what film school did for you. What was the curriculum, and what about it drew you further into the film industry?
A couple of things, actually. One of them was the excitement and the fulfillment of collaboration.
Yeah.
You know, as a writer, you're just stuck in front of a keyboard, and you've got a world going on in your mind, but it can also be kind of a lonely and isolated place. When you actually get on a film set and start working with other people and sharing those visions, and hopefully everybody tapping into the same vision, if you've got a good director and a good sense of that unity, it's really magic.
Mm-hmm.
Also, it was really good for me because I have a dual career as a producer and director and as a writer, to learn a lot of different aspects of the production process. So I think my first job was as script supervisor. The second one was as the chef, and then, being a grip, and then doing wardrobe, and then, So film school gave me all those different opportunities to see kind of a holographic view of the filmmaking process, which then, when I got into more serious writing, it really gave me a heads up on what can and can't be done on a set.
Right. Well, but your experience as a producer and a director in particular, has that made you a better writer?
Absolutely. For one thing, you know that it's probably not a really good idea to write in those elephants in pink tutus on the beach. It's going to be hard to get and real expensive. So you learn a lot of the practicalities, and then also you learn a lot about coverage and what needs to be in every scene.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times, if the writer is aware of that, it makes it a whole lot easier for whoever's directing it, whether or not they have any experience directing. If the script itself is written with those kinds of indications, now obviously, you're not going to write close-up and then wide shot and all that for a script that you're writing to sell.
Right.
But if you do write your descriptions lucidly enough, then you're really going to give the people who are actually putting it on digits or putting it on celluloid a better chance of getting the kind of coverage that they can then use to make a really full and rich story when they get into the editing room.
Yeah. Your first book was titled Inner Voices.
Actually, it's Inner Drives.
Inner Drives. Okay. Well, tell me a little bit about that one. What inspired that one, and what were you exploring in that book?
Oh, thank you for asking. Inner Drives, the subtitle of it is How to Write and Create Characters using the 8 classic centers of motivation, and that's the chakras. And I had been studying a lot of the mystery school and physics of metaphysics, comparative mythology, and I kept noticing that the chakras would turn up in a lot of the symbolism of the wonderful classic myths and stories.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought, well, gosh, this appears to be just a natural storytelling tool, and I started looking further into it and discovered that a lot of the myth makers had been people who actually studied in what they call the mystery schools, and basically it's the physics of metaphysics and how the world works and human psychology and all that, and saw that they would make up stories to explain the different psychological states of being and how we moved through them in the course of our personal evolution or just in our everyday lives. So I just thought, well, gosh, I'll just pull all this ancient wisdom into a book and hopefully make it more accessible to writers and storytellers by giving examples from real life and from stories throughout time, and then with suggestions and exercises and how to use those chakras to create characters. And I'm now teaching actors also through this system. And that's been really exciting.
I definitely want to ask you about your storytelling techniques from an actor's point of view a little bit later, but this new book is called The Power of the Dark Side, Creating Great Villains in Dangerous Situations. And, there's so many storytelling, screenwriting kind of how-tos out there. And this one is unique because it does deal with the concept of evil and how we represent evil in our works. Is that what's sparked the notion for this book, to kind of fill that void?
Absolutely. You are so right. It was. As a story consultant, one of the biggest problems that I see is an imbalance between the protagonist and the antagonist. Mm-hmm. And you particularly find this in the genres of what we now call spiritual cinema, or in religious films, or, the sweet little stories, children's films. And I started looking around and didn't find anything that was really addressing that, and said, gosh, well, maybe I'll just write it. And fortunately, my publishers were amenable. And so my goal then was to put together information and insights and hopefully some inspiring clues and writing exercises that would help people create better stories because they're creating more vivid villains and because they have more believable situations for their heroes and heroines to go up against. Yeah,
tell me how it seems to me that the concept of evil, just like the concept of the hero, has morphed over the years. We're definitely not in the era with the mustache twirling villain any longer. Tell me that transformation. How has the ideal of the villain changed?
Oh, that's an interesting question, and I try to address it in the first section of the book, which is about defining evil. Mm-hmm. What is evil? Well, it depends on who you ask. It depends on when you ask the question, and it depends on your perspective. I think a lot of it you can, let's just talk about globalization for a moment. When you had people living in a small community, in a village, evil was different in scope and in impact than a global community like we have now. And a lot of that is just you define evil by what opposes what you consider a pleasant and a productive life. Mm-hmm. So if your life doesn't go any further than the boundaries of your farm or the edge of your village, then that which is evil is interpreted by you in those terms. Mm-hmm. So as society has grown and as life has gotten more complex, so too have the evils that we face. The dark side has gotten bigger as well.
Yeah, this is something, and this is something that interested me, and it goes back to, I think, the way actors approach characters as well. You mentioned perspective, and you do make it clear from the beginning that evil is all a matter of perspective. I know that whenever actors are asked about, how did you play that evil guy, they always say the same thing. They say, well, he doesn't think he's evil. I mean, he's perfectly, he has the perfect reason why he's behaving the way he is. That's important, isn't it, to understand that?
Very important, and I spend quite a bit of time in the first of the book going over that and stressing to writers that you really need to understand the worldview of your villain.
Yeah.
What do they believe? What rewards are they after? What justifies for them what they're doing? Although, too, and this, it does get a little bit dicey because you do then have a couple of types of characters where that may not really count. Somebody's totally psychopathic. They just don't have the wiring in the brain to get it. Mm-hmm. And so it doesn't matter if they don't have to justify it. In other words, it's just what they want to do, so they do it.
Well, tell me how you fall on some of the most infamous kind of villains that we've seen in film lately. I know you speak of them in your book. How would you describe the villain, so to speak, in Seven? Obviously psychotic, but obviously has the justification for what he does in his own mind.
Yes, he does. And now here, this is me, practicing psychology without a license. But
go right ahead.
I think, a lot of people get an impression of good and evil when they're very, very young, because that's the socialization process. We all go through it, or we'd all just be, running through the streets and the jungles and be totally wild people.
Yeah, our parents give us that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then depending on, their points of view, the religion that you're brought up in, the culture you're brought up in. For that particular character, he was obviously influenced by a very strong biblical hand. And so those 7 deadly sins were, one can surmise, pounded into this character. And then because he had bad head wiring and never got wired for empathy and was a psychopath, then that impression of those evils just flipped way over into the dark side, and you put those two things together, and it became a deadly combination.
Yeah. I would imagine probably the most kind of beloved, for lack of a better word, villain of the past several years is probably Hannibal Lecter. I mean, the most kind of electrifying. And I'm interested, too, in the way his character kind of parallels with the hero of the story, with Clarice, where it's tell me about that relationship the way you see it, the strength of the hero in contrast to the so-called villain in that piece.
That's a hard one because he is such a complex character, and I don't think she's that complex, but he is. Now, she is steadfast and she is honorable, but not terribly complex, and that's okay for that story because she serves as a mirror for his complexity. Right. I heard just a couple of days ago, and I wish I'd had this conversation before I wrote the book, somebody said, I think Hannibal Lecter consumed people because he loved them so much. He had this devouring curiosity and sensuality about humanity, and he just wanted to absorb it. And I kind of stood there for a moment with my mouth open and my eyes wide, and then I thought, I kind of see your point.
Especially on the prequel that they made a couple of years ago, that kind of makes sense.
It does, doesn't it? And you have to step over a little bit into the side of kind of uber sensuality. And that, that consuming thing. You know how lovers often say, I just want to consume you. Don't take it seriously.
But it does fascinate me, Lecter's relationship with the heroine, in that he is constantly challenging her. It's not about the chase, so to speak, the good guy going after the bad guy. He is challenging a lot of what makes up her character.
Yes, and I think we might presume, without jumping into the original author's head, but we might presume that he's looking for a worthy opponent. Somebody that smart, that clever, is always trying to find their match.
Well, that goes back kind of to the old Boris Karloff, Bela Lugosi movie, The Black Cat, which was probably which was the heat of its day when you had those two titans on the same screen. And let's be honest, at that time, I think this is the 30s, I may be wrong, but that was the be-all, end-all, the ultimate, pairing up of these two icons.
Oh, that was like the Predator versus Alien of the time?
Yeah, that or Heat, whichever example you want to use.
Uh-huh.
I do think it's valuable, though, for that relationship to kind of exist. You're talking about creating dangerous situations, too, to kind of make that relationship between the villain and the hero more complex, to kind of challenge the hero.
Absolutely.
And another film that you discuss somewhat in the book is Schindler's List. And would this fall into the groupthink kind of mentality that you cover in your book? Tell me about that notion, the groupthink mentality.
Oh, I love this concept because we can see it every day all around us. Whether or not you've come up against the bureaucracy at the DMV, or you're going on a war protest march, or maybe in your story you're dealing with Darth Vader and the evil empire. There is a lockstep process. There's a hive mentality. There's a mob mood that is part of the human psyche. Mm-hmm. And at times we just tend to lock up and march in lockstep and get locked into ideas and conform to these ideas that otherwise on our own we might not even go along with. And so when you look around and you see that, once again, in our rise from a village to a global village, and the complexity, they say that the sure sign of a culture having gone from primitive to more civilized is the rise of the bureaucrats. So whenever you get this, the bureaucracy, where this is the way we've always done it, this is the rule set, these are the patterns we have to follow, then you start having the problem of groupthink, where the individuals don't think for themselves. It provides a wonderful opposition for a heroine, because it's hard to argue with anybody. You can't find an individual to argue with.
So, excuse me, so would that be like when you talk about globalization, I guess in the last decade, or really the last 2 decades, and you see like films like The Constant Gardener, where the pharmaceutical company, they're the baddies. So these movies where big business is really, I guess since the end of the Cold War, big business has become the bad guy.
Yes, it has. The corporatization of the planet, and whether it's the corporations themselves, business, and include in there the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank.
Yeah, they're always stand-ins.
Yeah, it's a weird thing, and I talk about it a little bit there, that through, I think it was even a clerical error back in the late 1800s, corporations in law were given the status of a human being. Mm-hmm. And that gave them all sorts of rights that we probably shouldn't have given them.
No, not at all.
We're reaping the bad rewards from that now.
We still are.
Yes. And it's the kind of thing where, that phrase, it takes on a life of its own. Mm-hmm. Well, it just happens. An idea, an ideal, an entity like that takes on a life of its own and sucks up the people who, Enron, the people who work with it.
Yeah, that's like with the remake of the Fun with Dick and Jane. Big business at the time. It was took place in 2000, but then the corporation was the bad guy. Or in the original Rollerball with James Caan, the corporation is the bad guy.
That's right, Jonathan.
Yeah.
Yeah, and too bad about the remake, but
I didn't even bother with it.
Yeah, a friend of mine who actually got me into film school in the first place said, Pamela, when Rollerball first came out, it was futuristic. Now it's a documentary. Because indeed the corporations have taken over. So groupthink is a wonderful opposition situation, a wonderful antagonist for an individual hero, because you can get that David and Goliath thing.
Yeah.
You also then have the wonderful opportunity of pulling somebody out of the system, seducing them out of it, and getting them to help. to Turncoat, like in The Insider.
Yes.
Oh, you picked Jamie's favorite movie.
Oh, did I? Okay.
Anything with Pacino, you're on my side. So.
Okay, great.
I'm interested.
That whole Seduction was a wonderful tour de force for him.
Mm-hmm.
It really was. Yeah, absolutely. I want to close off with a little discussion on the anti-hero, which seems to be becoming more and more popular as of late. You know, it used to be we liked our heroes kind of straightforward, and we see that, you know, even this weekend with the Indiana Jones film. You know, we like them vulnerable here and there, but more and more they're becoming. I see it mostly in comic book films. They have their own demons that they contend with, and it's almost like at times they are their worst enemy. What do you attribute to that kind of shift?
Okay, a couple of things actually. In the book, I talk about the 3 levels of the dark side, and one level is the dweller on the threshold, and that's our internal, personal demons that we have to deal with. And in a culture where self-actualization and self-investigation and self-confession is really predominant, then it just kind of makes sense that our media heroes are going to be of the same ilk. So you're going to get a lot of this internal personal angst and investigation that's very, very different from what came out of, let's say, post-World War II. With the strong silent type, we just don't talk about what we saw. We don't talk about what we felt. So there's been a shift then. The therapeutic human potential movement, I think, is responsible for a lot of that shift in how we're portraying the heroes. And then also, I was listening to the last part of your the last interview.
Yes, ma'am.
And I love being able to do this. Let me just quote myself and read a little bit here from the section on the anti-hero.
Right.
Anti-heroes typically arise from overregulated, corrupt, declining societies. They uphold the true ideal which the rest of society now just mocks or ignores. So, because they harken back to the good old days, rough and ready anti-heroes are more popular in a culture's stories when people are disillusioned in the overregulation stage and beyond. So I think part of it is, in a way, maybe an adjustment of what do we really want as individuals and what do we really need as a society. And I think we're still trying to figure it out, which is why some of the superhero stories work and others don't.